fact, I'm writing a book on this, I should say rewriting, or maybe rewriting. And, but when I was exploring all the, because it's an extremely complex issue, which has many ramifications, and while exploring the various ramifications, I came upon a number of unacceptable shortcuts, wrong methodologies which were used in this debate and which I thought deserved a presentation in themselves. So what I'm going to discuss here is the way some evidence has been fabricated or exaggerated or twisted. And in fact, I've been obliged to take only a small sample because there is so much more. And this is peculiar, I believe, to the Aryan debate. Such issues have been debated in many civilizations. For example, in Europe, there have been many debates about the Neolithic invasion of Europe, about when did the Greeks come to Greece. I mean, these debates have taken place in many parts of the world. It's not at all unique to India. But I believe it is pretty unique to India that we should have such shabby methods coming into play, and this is what I want to illustrate. So, first of all, literary evidence. I will begin with Professor Michael Witzel, whom you've already heard about. This is about, and this is, well, I will give credit where credit is due in a moment. You see, Professor Witzel is a fine scholar and Sanskritist and professor at Harvard University. And he has been a staunch for various reasons, which I need not go into. I'm totally impersonal in this presentation. He has been a staunch defender of the concept of an Aryan invasion, downgraded later on to a migration. And he writes that he's struck by the number of vague reminiscences of foreign localities and tribes in the Rig Veda, implying, of course, that in that case, the Rig Vedic people would have had a foreign origin. Now, the word vague is interesting, and what examples does he give? So he says, well, the Rig Veda speaks of Vedic lands crossing many rivers. I'm using exact quotations. And having gone through narrow passages, and then, of course, he interprets, and I should say straight away over-interprets, that this applies to the crossing through the Afghan passes, and then all the Indus river system, that is the Indus and its tributaries. So he, as a meticulous scholar, Professor Witzel gives you always references, which I happened to go and recheck carefully. And what did I find? I find that there was not a single reference in the entire Rig Veda to the crossing of many rivers. The two hymns that he cites, these are the references here, the two hymns that he cites are simply about gods halting the course of a river. I'm not giving the background. There are certain kings, there are certain battles around this. It doesn't matter to us. But there are only two hymns which actually say the same thing about one river whose water was stilled by gods. This has absolutely nothing to do with the crossing of many rivers. So this could be a detail. The problem is that this pattern repeats itself. For example, what are these narrow passages? So Professor Witzel translates one particular hymn in the 6th mandala saying, "We have come into a pathless country, the broad earth has become narrow." And this he takes to be again the landscape of the Afghan passes, and then the entering into the Indus plains. Jan Gonda, who was a famous Dutch Vedic scholar who's produced a lot of books on the Veda, translates the same passages as saying, I have to shorten the whole mantra, it's not the full mantra here, the earth, though usually broad, has become narrow. And Jamieson and Brereton, who have produced recently the most probably authoritative, if we can use the word authoritative in the case of the Rig Veda, English translation of the entire text, and certainly the most meticulous, I should say, translated as though it was wide, the land has become narrow. So though it was wide, the land has become narrow is translated into Afghan passes and the emergence into the vast Indus plain. So this is at best over-interpretation. And in any case, it cannot be securely used for any such conclusion. Then there is the famous case, I will explain why it is famous in a moment, of the Baudhayana Shorter Sutras. Now, as you know, the sutra literature belongs to the first millennium BC. These texts are impossible to date very precisely, but anything between 4 and 800 BC, I'm taking a wide window, where Professor Witzel produced in 1989 a translation of a passage which read, Ayu went eastward, his people are the Kuru, Panchala, etc. This is the Ayava migration. The others stayed at home. His people are the Gandhari, Parsu, and Arata. And this is the Amavasava group. So what his translation produced was a text where you had one people migrating eastward and another staying at home. And that is the Afghanistan region and beyond westward. So therefore, if this is correct, it will imply that the group that moved eastward moved into India. This was his conclusion. And then immediately, this piece of evidence was recycled, and I'll be using the word recycling quite a lot in this presentation because we'll see a lot of these mistranslations, errors being re-quoted again and again by... So she referred in a lecture at JNU in 1999, she referred to Professor Witzel's translation, and she added, in fact, when one looks for them, there are evidences for migration. The only problem was that she didn't give any further evidence whatsoever. So one still wonders, where are those evidences for migration? However, she is not the only one. The late Ram Sharan Sharma, R.S. Sharma, fondly nicknamed in archaeological circles RSS, for those who are interested. So R.S. Sharma quoted this translation of Professor Witzel and called it the most explicit statement of immigration into the subcontinent. Right. Now, it so happens that Dr. Konrad Elst, who is with us, a few years later went back to the original, rechecked carefully, and found that this was a mistranslation. And that in fact, and Witzel said that it was this passage had escaped notice because it had never been translated. It had been translated by the great Dutch scholar Caland. And in fact, this is what it reads. To the east went Ayus. These are the people which originated as a consequence of Ayus going forth. To the west went Amavasu. And when you read the Sanskrit, it's quite obvious that there is an elision, and the construction is simply a parallel construction, and one verb is not repeated, but it's absolutely clear that one group went to the east, one group went to the west. So if at all we're going to use this as a piece of evidence, it would simply mean that from some central region of North India, one group went eastward and the other went westward out of the subcontinent. In any case, the translation was wrong, number one. Number two, what is the point in using a text from possibly 500 BC in support of the Aryan Invasion Theory? If at all it happened, it would have been a whole millennium earlier. And then we are told that this is a strong piece of evidence for the whole theory. It is simply a bad methodology, and the translation itself being bad, nothing at all was established. But though Professor Witzel was confronted with this, initially he put it down to a clerical mistake. Then it was pointed out to him by Vishal Agarwal, and later Professor Bibilal also wrote on this passage at length that Professor Witzel had quoted the same translation a few years earlier in a paper published in France. So then after that, there was no further comment, and neither Professor Tapa nor R.S. Sharma, to my knowledge, have retracted their statements on this wrong translation. So fine. Then exploded theories. So India is, we are told, India is a museum of races. This is a slogan often used in Government of India tourism websites and such things. But I would like to say that India is also a museum of exploded theories. One of them is the racial theory of the 19th century between, the Aryan race, the tribal races, autochthones, the Dravidian race, and so on, to such a point that Thomas Trautmann, a very careful historian of ancient India, based in the US, who wrote a brilliant book called Aryans and British India, where he doesn't discuss the Aryan theory in itself. He personally supports the coming of Aryan speakers to India, but that doesn't interfere in his book. But what he wants to show in his book is how the whole racial and often racist background to the theory was harmful to Indian society because it was a tool used by the British colonial rulers. And he concludes his book by saying that the racial theory of Indian civilization still lingers, is a miracle of faith. He's referring to the constant use, even in textbooks in India, of still the concept of an Aryan race and the Dravidian race, and not even realizing that this is the very concept that led to the Nazi ideology, and that the very biological concept of race has been emphatically rejected. It's impossible biologically to define what is a race. Even if you take the blacks, it may be a race in popular parlance, but genetically speaking, they belong to a lot of totally different groups, and there is no way to define it rigorously. So he asks, is it not time that we did away with it? The concept of race does nothing to illuminate our understanding of the ancient sources of Indian history, and on the contrary has only served to corrupt our reading of them. So what he says is, let us read the Rig Veda, but without this notion of race, which is simply missing from it. However, Professor D.N. Jha, former professor at Delhi University, Dr. Meenakshi Jain here was one of his illustrious students, wrote a book, Ancient India in Historical Outline, in the I think he wrote it in the late 1970s perhaps, and it went through many, many reprints because it's very useful in its kind of format. Till 2009 at least, he writes, the early Aryans were generally fair, the indigenous people dark in complexion. The color of the skin may have been an important mark of their identity. This is exactly what 19th century racial and often racist European scholars used to write about Indian races. So this is quite amazing to find such a survival, even disregarding the advice of Thomas Trautmann, whom I assume Professor Jha would have read years after Trautmann wrote. This racist division of India continues, though it has no support in the text, as many researchers have shown. Then we come to archaeological evidence. And here is something where really we have a lot of, if this debate had not been so intense and sometimes so hitting below the belt, it would be quite comical, to be frank, because we find so much of obviously overblown statements. For example, Professor Shirin Ratnagar, who taught archaeology at JNU for a long time, is tempted in her own words to interpret a few damaged stone statues at Mohenjo-daro and Dholavira. And it is true that a few stone statues were found in a damaged condition, but then pretty much everything that you dig out of archaeological sites is in a damaged condition, as she interprets them as portraits of a royal lineage that were vandalized during a rebellion or a major dynastic upheaval, during which the royal portraits were viciously demolished. Now, this is a very fine scenario. Perhaps a Bollywood film could be conceived around this sentence. The problem is that there's absolutely not a bit of evidence in support of such a statement. And yes, the statues are damaged, it is true. There are also statues which are not damaged. For example, this is the well-known figurine of the so-called priest king, which normally should be fitting into her dynastic picture. and yet it's totally undamaged except for the bottom part. So this is a case where there's obviously overinterpretation of very, very flimsy evidence. But matters do not end there. You might have heard about the famous Dr. Mortimer Wheeler, who was Director General of the Archaeological Survey in the 1940s, and who reinterpreted the skeletons found in certain streets of Mohenjo-daro. Groups of skeletons were found altogether, I think about 30-something. And he made this famous accusation that, this is obviously Harappan people slaughtered by the incoming Aryans. And he says, Indra, very dramatically, he said, Indra stands accused. So Indra, the leader of the Aryan hordes, was accused of having smashed into the Harappan cities. And we find Shri Ratnagar. She calls these controversial skeletons. I will explain why in a second, in fact. But it confirmed in her an impression of intense enmity and hatred. The underlines are mine. And this is surprising because George Dales, an American archaeologist in 1964, had already written an extensive paper totally refuting Wheeler's theory on the basis that, number one, there was no proof that the skeletons belonged to the same layers in the archaeological stratigraphy, and therefore they might have belonged to different epochs. Number two, a few had signs of injury on their bones, but, and this is the work of Kenneth Kennedy, the late, who passed away a couple of years ago, a bioanthropologist of Cornell University who did a lot of work on Harappan skeletons, and he was able to prove that those injuries had healed before the death of the person. They were not death-causing injuries in any case, for the few that were there. And his own interpretation was that probably they were victims of a flood or some sloppy burial. Basically, we have no conclusive theory to explain these skeletons, but there's also nothing to confirm Mortimer Wheeler's explanation. And much less this concept of intense enmity and hatred. This is really a case of, projecting what one has in mind on the evidence. And in fact, what evidence does Shri Ratnagar bring out in support of political significance, because she speaks of the political significance of these skeletons? Well, Mesopotamian tablets. Because Mesopotamian tablets do mourn the destruction of cities. So you use a tablet written perhaps 1,000 years earlier in a Mesopotamian city, mourning the destruction of a city, which is fine. And then you say that this, hints that this is the same thing which happened here. I do not think that this is a clean method personally. Destruction by fire. Interestingly, a lot of Harappan sites, well, not a lot, I think 6 to 7, have come up with evidence of destruction by fire. And this turned out to be very interesting for a number of scholars, such as Professor Jha again, who says that a major blow to the Harappan civilization, according to dominant view, he doesn't define what is this dominant view, let us pass, was given by a group of barbarians who began to migrate into India a little before the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. So Shrikant, for your information, Aryans are barbarians, in addition to all the rest. At several places in North Balochistan, thick layers of burning may have been taken to imply the violent destruction of whole settlements by fire. So this is one statement. I'm coming to the evidence in a minute. Romila Thapar, and you see again this recycling, economical use of sparing evidence, who writes, some Harappan settlements in the northwest and Punjab might have been subjected, please note the words of imply, might have been subjected to raids and skirmishes such as are described in the Rig Veda. So she's obviously alluding to the skirmishes between, for example, the Arya tribes and the Dasyus in the Rig Veda. And she says, for which there appears to be occasional evidence at some sites, for example, Kot Diji. Kot Diji is a Harappan site in Sindh, today Pakistan. So let us now, and yes, there is also Professor Irfan Habib, who refers to several sites in Afghanistan, and who says that they were destroyed with such violence as to leave traces in the archaeological record. And these traces are layers of ash. Similar traces of arson are found also at Nal in Balochistan and the Indus border settlement of Dabarkot. The inference then seems irresistible that there were invasions from the west. Why from the west is not explained. Why not from the north? Why not from the south? Anyhow, which overwhelmed first the Helmand cities, then the late Kot Diji culture, and finally the Indus civilization. It is painful, he adds, but unavoidable to reflect on the fate of the people of the Indus civilization at its end. As the towns were abandoned and fell to hostile elements, large numbers might have been seized and enslaved. It's a very painful scenario with words like might again. And what is the evidence at the end of the day? All this is taken from Stuart Pigott, 1950. I will quote the entire passage in my book. This is almost verbatim quoting, but without a reference to him. And where he pointed to the presence of ash layers at Ranagunda, Nal, Dabarkot, Gumla, Kodiji, and Karanpura is a recent addition. It's a site in Rajasthan which has been excavated by Dr. V.N. Prabhakar of Archaeological Survey of India. He was with us over lunch, where he also found an impressive layer of ash. However, wherever the stratigraphy, and this is the clinching issue, wherever the stratigraphy was clear, this layer of ash has always been found in the transitional phase between the early Harappan period, which ends about 2700 BC, and the mature Harappan phase, which is where the cities blossom and are built, which starts about 2600 BC. The layer of ash to which all these scholars have been referring to dates to about, let us say, 2600 BC. So, when Professor Thapa refers to raids and skirmishes such as are described in the Rig Veda, if we extend her logic, it means that the Rig Veda must be about 2600 or 700 BC. But what she has in mind is 1500 BC. She does not even realize that she's talking about a totally different archaeological period altogether. So is it ignorance? Is it incompetence? Is it willful distortion? I have no clue. It is for you to kindly decide. And Gregory Purcell, a fine American archaeologist who passed away a few years ago and wrote many books on the Indus civilization, discussed actually extensively the intriguing presence of these layers of ash at 6 or 7 Harappan sites. And his conclusion, he observed first of all that most mature Harappan sites, that is to say of the urban phase, were actually built on virgin lands, not on pre-existing sites. Number one. Number two, that whenever they were on earlier existing Harappan sites, so they are called technically early Harappan settlements, often the early Harappan settlements was burned down. And the mature Harappan, the city, was erected on top. So his interpretation was that this was perhaps an act of renewal. That is to say, deliberately destroying an earlier existing settlement so that the place would be free for the construction of the city. At least this is a reasonable hypothesis. In archaeology, there is very rarely any final proof. But the hypothesis is reasonable. In any case, there is absolutely no trace of human conflict in any of these settlements. If there had been skirmishes, battles, if, let us say, Aryans or anyone else had invaded those settlements and sacked them and set them on fire, there would be a lot of other kinds of traces, including skeletons, including weapons, including a lot of disturbed layers. On the contrary, this looks like a very clean and deliberate destruction. So therefore, apart from the chronology, even the interpretation of the destruction doesn't work well. Now, one of the major tables in my book will be this one. There is a lot of discussion on the nature of a number of cultures that appear in the 2nd millennium BC after the disintegration of the Harappan urban order. You know that the Harappan civilization somehow did not survive, at least not in its developed urban form. And about 1900 BC, for a variety of reasons which I will not go into, this urban order, this what might have constituted a Harappan state, a certain sharing of conventions, standards, which together made the Harappan civilization, that disintegrated. And instead, we find all over the landscape, and let me go from west to east, a number of regional cultures like the Gandhara grave culture in the region of what is today the Swat Valley, but also a little beyond. Pirak culture is in Balochistan. Jukar culture is in Sindh, or perhaps Balochistan, but just close to the plains of Sindh. Then there is the cemetery age culture at Harappa, in the late phase of Harappa. There is OCP or ochre color pottery, which emerges especially in the Ganga Yamuna Doab, but also a little bit further west and quite a lot further east into the Ganges plains. You have the copper hoard culture, very mysterious culture producing masses of copper tools, weapons, or ceremonial weapons, weighing sometimes hundreds of kilos and being buried at various places across north and central India, and apparently having some connection with the previous OCP culture. And then finally, the painted gray ware culture, which is also, let us say, across, well, it has a much farther spread. It spreads from the Harappa region all the way to, let us say, Kosambi in Uttar Pradesh today. So what is interesting is that today, to cut a long story short, because I wouldn't have time for a full development, today archaeologists have meticulously investigated all of these cultures as well as they could. Sometimes the evidence is very scanty. For example, the copper hoard culture, there's a lot of evidence on the tools, the artifacts, but there's absolutely zero evidence on who made them and what kind of settlements they were associated with. So every culture poses specific problems, but the archaeologists have invariably, for the others at least, the other cultures at least, shown that they evolved in continuity with the earlier Harappan culture. There is actually no break in the archaeological record. And yet, you find all these scholars proposing, and all of them great scholars, by the way, very fine experienced archaeologists or Indologists and so on, proposing that this or that culture is Aryan, is the work of the Aryans. So that is letter A. LH stands for late Harappan. And you can see that we have complete confusion or complete lack of agreement, lack of a consensus between all these scholars. Everybody reads this or that culture as being Aryan according to his or her chosen preferences as to what defines a material Aryan culture. This is a major problem which has been bugging Indo-Europeanists in Europe, in Russia, in Central Asia, and bugging archaeologists also in the Indian subcontinent. How do you define a material Aryan culture? A literary Aryan culture, yes, Rig Veda allows us to define what is the literary Aryan culture, but what is a... So some says, well, the horse has to be there at any cost, And I'll come back to the horse in the case of the Gandhara grave culture as just one example. Others say that we need weapons of this kind, and so on and so forth. And the discussions are endless. What this simply shows, and I will not spend more time on this table, is that there is absolutely no consensus. And you can interpret, and we have two extreme cases. One is Asko Parpola, who's done a lot of work on the Indus script and has published these magnificent collections of Indus seals. But he has extraordinary theories that the Aryans are all over the place. And not only, of course, in India, they are also in the Bactria Marjana archaeological complex. They are also in Iran. They are basically all over the landscape in the 2nd millennium BC, and every single culture that he discusses is authored by the Aryans. And there is a French scholar, Bernard Sergent, author of Genèse de l'Inde, the Genesis of India, who has a pretty similar perspective in which he interprets almost every culture of the 2nd millennium BC in India as being the work of the Aryans. So this is something which today's archaeologists emphatically reject. Wherever there is good stratigraphy, there is a continuity with the earlier layers. There's a continuity in the technologies of pottery making. There's a continuity in the pottery designs, motifs, and so on. And therefore, it is quite impossible for the Aryans to have come and colonized all these cultures without any visible cultural break at the same time. So the Alchins, for example, Raymond and Bridget Alchin. Bridget Alchin passed away, I think, just last year, wrote, there is a widespread acceptance. They take the case of the painted greyware, which has been very often, for chronological reasons, associated with the Aryans. And she says, they write, there has been a widespread acceptance that the pottery called painted greyware should belong to the Rigvedic Indo-Aryan speakers. We cannot accept this view. Such items of material culture, and this is a critical point, which is completely neglected by the proponents of Aryan theories, such items of material culture are very rarely the private monopoly of any one ethnic, racial, let alone linguistic group, but are the products of craftsmen working within traditions and serving whole communities. Therefore, the very identification of a particular pottery style with a particular ethnic group is illegitimate. And this is a very important point. The French archaeologist Henri-Paul Francfort, who's a great expert on Central Asian archaeologists, wrote that in the subcontinent, this is in 1999, in the Indian subcontinent, the archaeological assemblages considered to reflect the coming of the Aryans by various authors, and he himself, this is not my parenthesis, it is his parenthesis, painted greyware, Gandhara grave, cemetery H, Juka, OCP, Pirak, etc., do not provide any stable or consistent picture. So you do not have any consistent picture of the arrival of a new material culture. And Gregory Purcell again, in the end, there is little in the archaeological record of northwest India that can be reasonably associated with the Aryans or the Rig Veda. Jean-Marie Cazal was an earlier French archaeologist who excavated at several sites in Pakistan, and he wrote a book on the civilizations of the Indus and its riddles, its enigmas, in 1969. And as early as in 1969, he confronted the same problem. Is there any trace of the arrival of the Aryans? And he wrote, up to now, Aryans have eluded every archaeological definition. There is so far no type of artifacts or ceramics that causes their discoverer to declare the Aryans came here. Here is a typically Aryan sword or goblet. So he says that it's just impossible to have these definitions. And Jean-Paul Demoule, another French, I quote these French archaeologists because they are not in India as well known as they deserve to be. Jean-Paul Demoule has been a consistent opponent and radical opponent of the entire Indo-European paradigm. He, in fact, rejects the very existence of Indo-Europeans. He's an extreme case in a way, but he has just published 2 years ago a massive 800-volume, very scholarly book on the whole Indo-European theory. And he writes, in order to prove a migration archaeologically, which is what our Indian scholars do not consider, it is necessary to trace step by step the diffusion of a complete material culture, pottery forms and decorations, tools and weapons, architecture, funerary practices, etc., from a specific region. Nowhere in India has any scholar been able to bring out such a consistent body of evidence as would be required by the Aryan theory at an archaeological level. Robin Cunningham, in a recent paper, is a British archaeologist who has just authored a very fine book on archaeology of early historical South Asia. And he takes both Papala and the Alchines to task for the theories of Aryan authorship of widely differing cultures from the Copper Hoard to the megalithic, because in fact Asko Papala doesn't stop at my table, he goes beyond, and the entire megalithic tradition of India is also attributed to the Aryans, which is quite extraordinary as a theory. And Cunningham writes, these interpretations suggest the simple equation that material culture equals people equals language, and are rather reminiscent of some of Child's culture historical framework. He's referring to Gordon Child, who was one of the pioneers of the Aryan theory at the archaeological level. So he says, processual and post-processual developments in archaeological theory have surely enabled us to abandon such crude equations and to acknowledge that the dynamics of material culture, ethnicity, and language are far more complex. Well, to abandon such crude equations, yes, except in India. Diffusionism in India is alive and well among Indian historians. I think I'm going to skip these horses well, let me deal with it quickly. In this Gandhara grave culture of the Swat Valley and a little beyond, about, I think now counting about 300 sites of that culture, I have the exact number somewhere, one iron cheek piece of a snaffle bit comes from Timargaha. This is taken to be a sign of domestication of the horse. It is one piece of snaffle bit. Two horses burial and the bronze model of a horse were found at Katale, and another site came up with a few depictions of the animal on pots. So therefore the presence of the horse can be taken as established. However, the problem is with the interpretation. And James Mallory, famous Indo-Europeanist, author of the great classic In Search of the Indo-Europeans, and a very honest scholar, I should say, though he has, of course, his opinions, but he's always careful to show the limits of the evidence, but not in this case. In this case, he speaks of a cultural break in the Swat Valley about 1800 BC. He speaks of two horse burials, horse trappings, all of which, in his words, makes an excellent fit with geographical scene depicted in the hymns of the Rig Veda, and it does so at the expected time. In other words, Gandhara grave culture is a very good candidate in his view for the coming of the Aryans. But there are problems. There are problems because, first of all, there's no evidence of a cultural break. The Gandhara grave culture is now proved to be in continuity with the earlier layers in the region. So therefore the cultural break is only in his imagination. What about the two horse burials? Horse burials are fascinating because in parts of Central Asia and the Russian steppes, horse burials were found with their masters in very impressive graves. And this bespeaks in the view of those scholars of Indo-European cultures and so on. But actually, these are not burials at all. Simply what happened is that two horse skeletons were found in an upper layer above a human cemetery. There is no archaeological connection between the horse skeletons and the human skeletons. And therefore, to suggest that horse burials are ritually, that horses were ritually buried is wrong. There is absolutely no evidence for this. And not only that, the layer in question, the upper layers in question, Akatale, belong to the first half of the first millennium BC, that is to say between 1000 and 500 BC. And that's much too late for the Aryans to have come into the region. If at all they came, that would have been at least another 500 or 600 years earlier. There are no horse trappings. He speaks of horse trappings. There are no horse trappings, only this one iron horse bit and nothing more. And yet you find the late Professor Suraj Bhan of Kurukshetra University, who spoke of horse burials associated with humans at Katale, a characteristic feature of the Gandhara grave culture. Now, the horse burials are probably not burials at all. The skeletons are there, that's all, and there is no association with the humans. And this is the only case of horse skeletons. Therefore, how can it be called characteristic of the Gandhara grave? So you see how one word here, one word there, and you end up inflating a very flimsy body of evidence into whatever you want it to mean. And even Upena Singh, who is normally a very careful historian, and I'm sure it's a blunder on her part, speaks of two horses buried along with the masters. Well, no, there are no burials of horses with their masters in the Gandhara grave culture. This is something she has picked up from somewhere. And finally, I wish to bring in a different aspect. I'll conclude in, I think, 2 minutes, which is that normally the Aryan debate should call for a proper debate. If you look at a book edited by Thomas Trautmann, the title is The Aryan Debate, published by Oxford University Press. But there is no debate. It's just a collection of papers on one side and a collection of papers on the other side. There is absolutely no internal discussion. And that is the whole difficulty why the debate has not progressed in India, is that dissenting voices have been demonized. I have to use this word because words like communal, jingoistic, chauvinistic, sometimes Hindutva have been heard as respected scholars, even like Professor Bilal, for example, for suggesting that perhaps the Aryans didn't come and perhaps the Indus civilization has a Vedic background. So again, I'm not discussing these positions. That's not my point today. But the point is, why can you not engage in a argument-based, evidence-based, as Dr. Nagaswamy spoke of pramana this morning, why can't we use proper pramanas to debate the Aryan issue? And why do you attack only Indian scholars? Why are you also attacking mainstream foreign scholars, mainstream academics like Edmund Leach, who wrote one of the most scathing papers against the Aryan paradigm ever written? Kenneth Kennedy, Jim Schaffer, Henri-Paul Frankfurt, Jean-Paul Demoule, Robin Cunningham, Angela Marc-Antoniou, one of the rare professional linguists to oppose the Indo-European linguistic model, and Thomas Kivisil and so on. They are established academics. They have rejected the whole Indo-European or Aryan paradigm. Why do you not also criticize them? But their work is never discussed in India. So there is a problem here. And I could take, but I will not spend time on this, the case of the Saraswati River, where we are told, again and again, I could give the exact quotations with words like Hindu chauvinist being used in magazines, various articles, and we are told that only, Hindutva inclined scholars are defending the identification between the Saraswati River and the Ghaggar Hakra of Haryana, Punjab, Rajasthan, Cholistan, and so on. But these are all the scholars who, long before the present debate, starting with Louis Vivien de Saint-Martin in 1855, the first to do so, proposed that this must be the relic of the erstwhile Vedic Saraswati River. So again, if you have a problem with this identification, fine. You have every right to have the stand you want to have. But then why don't you meet their arguments and discuss them and do so with civility and courtesy as much as you must extend to your Indian colleagues just the same. So all of these scholars have defended this identification, but only the Indian ones are demonized, not the Western ones, and that is a problem. So in conclusion, there is a good deal of fabricated or forced evidence, recycling of errors, which when they are proved to be errors, are not retracted. A scholar should have the humility to accept that he or she has made a mistake. It happens, and all scholars make mistakes. So if you do that, you should retract it. But this never happens. No discussion of alternative theories. This is something I didn't bring up today at all for lack of time, but there are always, in the Aryan debate, 5 or 6 alternative theories for any angle, and they are not discussed. And established standards of research methodology, in my opinion, are grossly violated in a way that would not be accepted of an undergraduate student of history. The same methodology followed by an undergraduate student of history would not pass if it was applied to some other period of Indian history. But here they are allowed to pass, and there is no mechanism for redress. Thank you very much.